from the beginning, the sword was very a spiritual thing and also a weapon.
Yeah. So obviously they can protect you physically,
Yes.
but they can also protect you spiritually. And once people get their heads around these concepts, they start to feel the real weight of Japanese swords. But there's lots of swords that have survived through centuries and been cared for and passed down from generation to generation so that we can appreciate them. All the generations of people that have passed it down and taken care of it so that you can appreciate it today. It's like meditation. It removes everything else that's bothering you and you just focus on the blade. It's like moving meditation, because you're focusing on what you're doing.
Paul Martin, welcome to our show.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
So you are a Tokyo-based Japanese sword and culture specialist, and you brought your expertise from a tenure as a curator from the British Museum.
Yes.
So what brought you to Japan?
So I realized that the swords in the British Museum were not enough to study Kante or sword appraisal and things like this. So I wanted to further my studies. So I just knew I had to move to Japan.
Okay. This was how many years ago?
I moved here in 2004.
So you've been here since?
Yeah.
Okay, and you have a new book coming out. It's called Japanese Swords and Armor.
Yes.
From Timetable agency. And this is a French version.
Yes, it's in French and Italian as well.
Okay, could you explain to us what your book will be about?
Yeah, so usually...
This is a beautiful book, by the way.
Thank you very much. So usually books are about samurai or about swords and things. So I wanted to make the connection between actual living historical people and the arms and armor that they owned.
I see.
So people could get a sense of their aesthetic sense and things like this. So it contains 30 famous samurai that range from the late Heian period right the way through to the Bakumatsu era, and the weapons and the swords and armor that they owned, and some fittings as well.
So it has a lot of bushos: Hojo Yasutoki, Tokugawa Ieyasu, Minamoto Yoshitsune.
Yeah, many famous. They're all very famous samurai. Yes.
So why are swords linked to samurais? Are they linked to the individuals?
Well, that's quite a difficult question actually, but because there were swords before the samurai, and even since the samurai period has ended, the swords continue to be made and have special importance to the Japanese people. But the curved sword emerged around the same time that the samurai were emerging, and that the shape changed over the periods, but until the end of the samurai era, and then there was no more changes in shape after that as well.
I see. This is a beautiful book. So why did you decide to write this book or publish this book?
I was asked to write a book on swords, but I had this idea that I wanted to make them more in context.
What's your favorite sword?
That's like asking me to pick my favorite child. But it's very difficult. I particularly like the Yamato Rige or the Sanchomo.
Sanchomo, okay.
Yeah, which is in. There's actually a fold-out page. In there of it. That's it there, almost in full size. And
such a beautiful book.
It's
wow.
This is a national treasure sword, and it recently sold for around $5 million. Wow.
And it was owned by Uesugi Kenshin, the very famous samurai.
And it's very flamboyant as well. It's a fabulous sword. It's actually called a national treasure within national treasures.
Wow. Okay. What's so special about this sword?
Well, the fact that it's so very flamboyant, and it survived all this time. But it has this characteristic part at the bottom of the blade there.
Wow.
And it was owned, it has historical importance as well because it was owned by Kenshin and his son, so it has lots of meanings,
Could you explain to our audience who Uesugi Kenshin is?
So he was a famous warlord from the Muromachi period, from around the 15th century, and and he had lots of battles with Takeda Shingen, So he was a very famous warrior who looked like a monk. But he was also known for being very strong.
So he was famous for Takeda, the rivals. There were two rivals, right? Takeda Shingen, and he wore like a white monk-like.
Yeah, that's right.
Yes, that's why he's extremely popular among pop culture in Japan also.
Right.
Well, this is just beautiful.
Yeah, but Kenshin and his son Kagekatsu had a list of 30 famous masterpieces that they owned, and this was like top of the list.
Wow. So that's why they call it the national treasure of national treasure. Wow. And this is your own sword, katana and tanto. It's owned by you?
Yeah, these two are owned by myself. Yeah, the top one is one that I use regularly for martial arts. The bottom one is a dagger of mine. It was a present to me. It's made by the master smith Matsuba Kagemasa in Miyazaki-ken, in Miyazaki Prefecture.
Wow. How does it feel like to own a sword? Because I'm a Japanese, but I don't own a sword, so
I'm kind of used to it. But obviously, but it is a very special feeling. And you could say that you feel spiritually protected by owning one as well. It's because they're not just weapons. They're very artistic pieces. So there's a kind of pleasure in taking care of them as well. Through what's called tere, where you have the powder and you
the maintenance. Yes.
And so it's very kind of relaxing. It's like it's kind of meditation when you're viewing swords as art and things.
Wow. So you were at the British Museum. So how is Japanese swords different from like Western weapons or Western art crafts?
So I think with Japanese swords, the Japanese recognize the beauty in the steel, and with Japanese swords, you have the hamon, the pattern of the hardened edge, which also has crystalline activities of different shapes within that, which all has terminology that relates to nature. So you have all these relations to nature. Even the grain pattern in the steel looks like wood grain pattern from trees and things. And there's this huge connection to nature that I think resonates with Japanese people in the first place. I have my own theory that there was the Jomon culture and the Yayoi culture. They like to polish things, so they polished magatama and then bronze swords and then bronze mirrors. But they went just shiny, reflective. But when you polish steel swords, that these patterns of nature came out of the steel, and this beauty came out. And so obviously, they were religious kind of objects in the first place, sacred objects in the first place. But when you see elements of nature appear in them, then you must think that the gods reside in them and things like this.
Right. As a Japanese, I kind of understand the aspects of swords, Japanese katana, but how do you explain to other parts of the people of Japan that swords are basically weapons, and weapons are supposed to basically kill people? And how does that balance between a weapon to kill a person and also something very spiritual and very connected to nature?
I think that when you explain Japanese swords to the Western world, you have to start from the origin myths of Japan, from the Shinwa, so it's from the Kojiki and the and the tale of Yamato no Orochi and Susanoo. So Susanoo killed the Orochi, and he discovered the sword in the tail of the Orochi, and he gave that to his sister, who's the sun goddess, the patron deity of Japan. And this became part of the imperial regalia and was passed down within the imperial family even until today. So in 2019, we had the enthronement of the current emperor, and beside him was a box with a sword that was discovered in the tail of a dragon.
Wow.
So I think that mythology and real history in Japan is kind of inextricable through the spirituality.
And it was that from the beginning, not historically speaking, but also from the beginning, the sword was very a spiritual thing and also a weapon.
So obviously they can protect you physically. But they can also protect you spiritually, as spiritual amulets. There's a phrase called omomori katana.
Omomori katana.
And there's one other phrase called kaho. So you have family treasures that are passed down through the family, but they can also double it as omomori katana. So I think this is very important. And once people get their heads around these concepts, they start to feel the real weight of Japanese swords.
Do you have trouble explaining that concept to the Western people?
No, I think that I used to give talks at the Samurai Museum in Shinjuku, and I realized that if I showed them the swords first, that they would pick them up and go, oh, cool.
Oh, cool, yeah. Like a gun or something, yeah.
But then if you not let them look at the swords and explain to them first about the spiritual connections and the spiritual roots of Japanese swords, when they pick it up, I go, oh my God, kind of, the reaction was completely different. So I think that until now, most explanations about Japanese swords have just been straight translations of Japanese explanations, which contains lots of things that are rudimentary to Japanese people that don't need explaining. But when you explain to Western people, you need to explain the background, the spiritual background and everything, and then they can really understand.
I see. Do you think is it because of like pop culture or modern culture, like Hollywood movies and comics, there's ninjas and samurais.
Yeah, I mean, even in Japan, you've had the
even in Japan, yes.
Chanbara movies.
Chanbara movies, yeah.
And swords are just not that strong. You know, there's a saying in Japan: a good sword should not bend, should not break, and should cut well. But this is an ideal, and this ideal is the same for swordsmiths in every culture all around the world. But it's not. It's an ideal. It's not a guarantee.
Right.
You know, and Japanese swords will bend and break, and and if they go edge to edge, they'll get big, huge chips in them, and they can't be repaired. But there's lots of swords that have survived through centuries and been cared for and passed down from generation to generation until today, so that we can appreciate them. So even today, when you appreciate a Japanese sword, you bow to the sword. So okay, so you're bowing to the sword and respect for the sword, but you're also bowing to all the generations of people that have passed it down and taken care of it, so that you can appreciate it today. You know.
So what's the definition of made to what's a good sword? Because I'm assuming it's not just a sword that it's sharp or strong. What's the definition?
Well, again, this is one of those things that it's just goes without saying.
Okay.
But to be a sword, it has to cut well. It has to cut.
Yes.
You know, that's the definition of a sword. You know, but beyond that, Japanese swords are very beautiful. So there's 3 elements. You have the shape, you have the grain pattern in the steel and the hues and textures, and you have the pattern of the hamon. So if you have a sword that has a great shape but has no hamon and no grain pattern, that can't be a great sword. You have to have balance between those 3 elements. And a nice balance, you know, a nice harmony of those 3 elements makes a great sword. You know, if it's too strong in one of the other 2 elements, then it's not such a great sword. You know?
So you have been studying Japanese sword for years. Do you feel that, like recent days, there's a lot of international interest towards Japanese swords?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's a general interest in samurai culture in Japan anyway. You know, even today it's still very exotic. You know, so recently we had the Shogun remake on
the
TV.
Disney Plus movie. Yeah,
it was amazingly popular, as was Last Samurai. But it's all very romantic.
Yes,
you know, but you know, but even with the 47 Ronin, I mean, there was a terrible movie about that. There was nothing like the real story.
Right.
But the 47 Ronin story is full of intrigue and, you know, and historical. It's very, very interesting when you read the politics and how their seppuku was decided in the end, you know, because they could have been executed as common criminals, you know.
So what makes people interested in such Japanese culture, especially Japanese swords?
I think that, I mean, it goes back a long way. I think that the Nitobe's Bushido book at the turn of the century, you know, I mean, the word Bushido hadn't really been used until, you know, he wrote his book.
Right.
But people began to understand the concepts, and this concept. I think that, I mean, you even got it in the 70s and 80s with the Ningyo. Ninkyo Eiga.
Ninkyo Eiga. Like Yakuza Eiga.
Yakuza Eiga.
Yes.
You know. So they were like I get the impression they were like the equivalent of the Western movie, but they were the cowboy movie,
right?
You know, but they were like the modern day samurai in a way, you know. And I think that this will continue, this kind of feeling. Now it's turned into manga and anime and Kimetsu no Yaiba and Tokyo Mamba and things like this. But I think that feeling, that connection of honor and duty, I think permeates everyone throughout the world. You know, that heroes have these feelings. You know?
As a Japanese, I feel that Bushido, the way of samurai, was kind of rediscovered after Japan was internationalized, because Nitobe Inazo, he wrote that book to explain Japan to the international world.
And also Zen. Around the same time, you had Suzuki Daisetsu and Zen in Japanese culture.
And the Book of Tea and everything.
Yeah.
So it was not purely Japanese. It was a Japanese way of Japanese to explain to the global society.
But again, it's another typical aspect of Japanese culture. For instance, ukiyo-e, the prince, the Japanese prince of the floating world.
Yes.
So Japanese people were not interested in this.
Right.
So they used them as packing, sent them abroad, and people like Van Gogh discovered them and went, wow, these are fantastic.
It was like a wrapping paper.
And Japanese people go, oh, they're fantastic. Oh, let's take care of them.
And they re-imported it back to Japan.
Right, exactly. You know. And the same with Bushido, the book by Nitobe, you know, and Suzuki Daisetsu and things like this.
So I want to ask about the modern day relevance of Japanese sword and katana. Do you think there's some message or symbol that we have to pay attention to? I feel it's not just a historical object. It's so modern and it connects to our lives living in this modern world.
Yeah, it's I mean, the challenge of every generation of swordsmiths is to right, is to meet the challenges of that generation to make swords relevant still. You know, obviously, and you know, so even today within Japanese culture, when there's a Shinto marriage ceremony, the bride will have a dagger in a harobe, and for funerals there'll be a tanto placed on the casket, and again it has this spiritual protective meaning to it. You know, the bride with the dagger, that goes back to samurai customs. You know, so that would be part of her dowry. So when her father gave her away, he would buy a excellent, or his most excellent tanto dagger and give it to her as part of his daughter. You know, give it. Yeah. But yeah, it's just the spirituality of Japanese swords. I mean, you know, it permeates everywhere. Even the tea ceremony. You know, if you go to most tea houses, there'll be a sword rack outside the front door where you're supposed to leave your sword before you go into the tea house and things like this. So I just think it's completely, so far that even Japanese people can't see it anymore, that it's so deeply ingrained in the culture.
Do you see any aspects in Japanese culture, do you say, that kind of relates to the spirits of Japanese swords?
I mean, I see it all the time, but I live
You
in
see
the
it all
sword.
the time, yes.
I live in the sword world. But even today, there's swords being devoted to shrines and things for you know, the gods to reside in, or for the protection of the gods, and these various reasons. And yeah, so you know, it's in everything. Kimetsu no Yaiba, you know, about the tamahagane. You pick your own tamahagane, and it's for killing demons. You know, not necessarily for killing other people.
Right.
You know, and this is one of the big misconceptions about Japanese swords. That they're offensive weapons, but actually they're these defensive weapons. They're the last of the last, and when it comes to the very last, then they're used to commit seppuku and things like this. You know, or ritual suicide.
You're right. I love Kimetsu no Yaiba. People all over the world like it, but it came up. You made an excellent point, because the swords are not used to like kill everyone or kill people, but it's to protect you, and it's like a symbol of yourself.
Yes, that's right. You know, so even Japanese martial arts are growing more and more popular around the world. So you have kendo. There's something like 52 countries taking part in the World Kendo Championships, and you have iaido, the use of a sword, you know, spreading around the world at the same rate, and then there's Koryu, there's old style schools as well that are spreading across the world, mainly because of the internet and things like this these days. But yeah, and this contains the spirituality of Japanese swords. So not, again, going back to the Suzuki Daisetsu thing, the sword is not for killing your opponent, but for killing your own ego and trying to make yourself a better person. You know, so that, again, that having a sword is kind of responsibility. You know? Is
that the reason why you got drew into Japanese swords, that the spirit thing?
I think so. I think that, and that they're such complicated objects.
Yes.
They're not just one thing. You know, they're not just art. They're not just a weapon. You know, they're not just spiritual things. They have such a wide range of meanings, and to different people they have different meanings as well. You know, so to try and hold all of those meanings or understand all of those meanings at the same time is interesting.
So why do you think the Japanese swords survived? Because in the 1800s, after the Meiji Restoration, Japan was modernized. And we're supposed to throw away our swords and wear Western clothes and be modern. But we kept the Japanese swords.
Yeah, well, I mean, they didn't really throw them away. All the good swords were kept by the elites.
Oh, yes, you're right. Okay.
You know, and even Emperor Meiji, when he was like feeling Nayandiru, he was feeling stressed about something, he would look at his swords and then kind of contemplate on his swords and then go back and make a decision. You know, about
to calm himself down.
Yeah. You know, and samurai were no longer needed. Even low-level samurai didn't want to be samurai anymore. They wanted to modernize, and they wanted a normal society. But then within 30 or 40 years, this samurai ethic went on to the populace, and everyone became samurai, you know, and then there was an expansion into Asia and, you know, and things like this. But yeah, you know, so I don't think it'll ever go away. So the sword remained relevant. And as soon as the levels of sword making and things got very low and dangerous, then it was revitalized again. You know?
Could you explain how, like, looking at the sword can calm you down? Because I know business leaders who actually look at the sword before making decisions, or do some kendo, which is before, to calm himself down.
Yeah.
Could you elaborate on this?
So, I mean, obviously the sword is very beautiful, but it's very subjective, you know? So when you look at a sword, you should probably think of it as scenery or canvas. So there's different patterns of hamon, you know, but you might have an irregular wave of hamon pattern, but in the top part, there might be a kind of mist. Now, this might be mountains and mist of the mountains and things, you know, or there might be a repetition of three trees, sugi, cedar trees.
Yes.
And they repeat down the blade. And this is called sanpon sugi. But when you, where that interacts with the grain of the blade, it might look like a row of cedar trees and distant mountains.
Interesting. Wow.
You know? And another one, you know, they're the same crystals, but there's two types of crystals. There's crystals that you cannot see individually with the naked eye, and these are called nioi. And this is old terminology, and nioi means fragrance, and you can't see fragrance either, which I find very interesting. But as the blade gets hotter, when they're heating it to quench it, the crystals get bigger, they group together and become bigger. And the ones that you can see with the naked eye are called nie. And nie means boiling. So the surface of steel is actually boiling. And then these crystals are frozen into place when they quench the blade into water. But these crystals also compared to, when they're mixed, they're compared to the Milky Way at night. So the individual crystals look like the shining stars in the dark night sky, and the clouds look like the Milky Way. So when you contemplate on a sword and you see these things, or you're looking at things and deciding what you see, it can calm you down, and it removes, it's like meditation. It removes everything else that's bothering you, and you just focus on the blade. And the same with practicing kendo or iaido. It's like moving meditation, you know, because you're focusing on what you're doing. You know.
So it's like seeing the whole nature, the whole universe.
Yes, yeah,
through
absolutely.
one katana, one sword.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. So let's look at the details. This is a cover of your book. So is this a Japanese sword on the cover?
It's been attributed to Masamune.
Masamune. Wow.
So, who's said to be the greatest swordsmith ever, who was active in the late Kamakura, early Namakucho period.
And this is you back in the...
This is when I was still working at the British Museum, and I used to come to Japan once or twice a year to career objects backwards and forwards. So when I was here, I would spend extra time studying swords. So I got to hang out with Yoshindo Yoshihara, who's a very famous swordsmith on the left there. And that's his son next to him, who sadly passed away a couple of years ago, Yoshikazu. And then there's a young me, but then on the right is a fifth generation Fujishiro sword polisher.
Sword polisher.
Yeah.
So I have a question. So in the modern days, there still is a sword polisher and swordsmith.
Yeah.
Who do they sell their swords to?
Yeah. So, right. So this is a good question, because people, when they think of swords, like they think of two things. They think of tamahagane equals Japanese swords, and the other thing is they think of just swordsmiths.
Yes.
But actually, there's about 7 or 8 crafts, you know, all related to Japanese swords. So you have the swordsmith, or actually before that, you have the person that makes the tamahagane, that makes the Japanese steel. And then you have the swordsmith, then you have a sword polisher, but you also have a habaki maker, which is a collar at the base of the blade, and you have a scabbard. You know, so you might have a plain wooden scabbard called a shirosaya, or you might have a full set of mountings. And if you have the full set of mountings, you also need the fittings, you need a man to wrap the handle, and you know, you need the person to lacquer the scabbard and all these different things. You know, so there's lots of different crafts involved. So the Japanese sword is just one team.
I see.
And if you remove one of those crafts, the whole lot will collapse.
Wow, so it's like an ecosystem.
Yeah.
Okay.
You know, so at the moment, it's quite. The sword world is not in a great shape at the moment. You know, it's you know, because there's a lack of scabbard makers and a lack of habaki makers. Now they don't just make these for new swords; they also make them to restore the old swords. So if one of these crafts disappears, you know, and this ecosystem collapses, then it's very difficult to actually restore the old swords as well.
Can it be like? Can a robot make that sword? It has to be a human.
No, every sword is different. So you might know the saying, "Sori ga awanai." So our curvatures don't meet, right? Which generally means nowadays you don't get along with someone.
Yeah, it's a popular saying in Japan. Yeah,
right. It comes from Japanese swords, because every Japanese sword is custom made. So every scabbard is custom made. So the same sword won't go into a different scabbard.
Okay, so one piece gone and everything will collapse. So how do they make their business? Who they sell their swords to?
But, I mean, there are international customers, but you know, there's free competitions every year. So you know, they have to try and make a name for themselves doing these competitions, which is very difficult for young smiths, because they haven't got a name for themselves yet. So then, you know, if they don't get a customer to buy their sword to put into the competition, they have to pay for all the other crafts themselves and put the time in to make the sword. You know? So it's quite difficult. Yeah.
So the challenge is to preserve that whole ecosystem.
Right.
Okay. And this is you. Yes.
This is me appraising the sword, or appreciating the sword.
Okay.
And yeah.
And let's go into detail. So this is Minamoto no Yorimitsu from your book, Tachi.
Okay, so this sword was said to have been owned by Minamoto no Yorimitsu, who was a very famous, brave warrior.
Yeah.
But this is called the Dojigiri, which he was supposed to have killed the Shuten Doji ogre of Mount Oe with this sword, which is a very famous kind of tale. But this sword still survives today, and it's in Tokyo National Museum, and anyone can go and see it. But these tales and these swords are kind of intertwined, and then they relate back to the people that own them. So I think these things are very important for Japanese culture, that these tales and relations to the people that own them are kept alive.
Right. And this is from Miyamoto Musashi.
Well, actually, these three objects. One is the goose on its own. That's a pair of manuki, and they're like decorative hand grips that go under the wrap, and they stop your hand from sliding up and down the handle. And the one on the right is a suba, a sword guard, that goes between the handle and the blade. And this other one there with the goose on it is called a kozuka, which is a small decorative handle for a utility knife that slides down the side of the scabbard. But all three of these items are said to have been made by Miyamoto Musashi. So you can see they're of the same raw materials, and they're of the same kind of theme and things like that. Or not same theme, but the geese are the same theme.
They're beautiful.
But these belong to the Hosokawa family for many generations.
I see.
The Kozuka handle is still in the Eisei Bunko Museum.
So this is a website from history of Hiroshima and Meito. Okay.
So this sword is called the Kosetsu Sa. The swordsmith was Sa, or Samonji. And but this sword and the mountains belong to Tokugawa Ieyasu. So this is a very famous sword. This is a national treasure, and it's a fabulous sword. It's it was made in around the Nanbokucho period, and it's a very beautiful sword.
Wow!
But the scabbard on this sword is actually this mountains is loosely based on this scabbard, because you can see this scabbard here. Is covered in ray skin.
Right.
And then it's been lacquered and polished down flat, so the dots come through the lacquer, the black lacquer.
The dots are just beautiful.
Yeah,
Wow.
So this is a sword we were talking about earlier in the book. That was in the fold-out pages.
Yes.
But this is housed at the Osafune Token Sword Museum in Okuyama.
Wow.
And so they purchased it for $5 million. Which sounds like a lot.
Yes.
But this is like 600-700 years old.
Right.
And if you compare it to a Rembrandt for $40 million, or a Da Vinci for $400 million, this is very reasonable.
That's
I think.
True. And it was owned by Uesui Kenshi and passed on to his son.
So it has great artistic qualities, and and it's a beautiful object, and it has a historical relevance.
And it was kept. It was the same from the Kamakura period. It has not changed.
It even has the original set of mountains that Uesugi Kenshin had for it.
How did they preserve these things? It's so historical and. Yes.
These things. This is a special thing about Japanese swords. They're cared for. They're taken great care of. And they're passed down from generation to generation as these treasures. As family treasures, or as as treasures in general. And they have great importance to the Japanese people. And and just these reflections. See, this hamon is called jukuchoji. So that means like piled up clove blossoms.
Wow.
So again, we have this relevance to nature. So clove blossoms,
Wow. So it's like feathers piled out, like blossom.
It could be feathers. Another name for it is the sanchomo, which could be like a burning mountain.
Burning mountain. Yes.
There's a burning mountain, or the mountain feathered bird feathers. And so a mountain pheasant feathers. But the actual pattern is called choji.
Choji. Okay. Wow.
This I was saying earlier about Emperor Go-Toba.
Yes.
And that he was a connoisseur, and he judged swords. And he was said to have had an eye better than people in the craft. But he actually made swords himself. He invited the top swordsmiths from around the country to come and make swords for him in Kyoto. And this was before the Jokyu disturbance. But he lost the Jokyu disturbance, but he was exiled to Okinoshima in Shimane Prefecture. But apparently the Hojo region still continued to send swordsmiths to the island so that he could make swords.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Wow.
And even today on the island, they have a fuigo, a bellows, a set of bellows that are said to have been used by Emperor Go-Toba, and also the remains of his funeral pyre. So you have this huge like legend that has things attached to it that are tangible, that you can go and see and look at.
Mm-hmm.
But so you had the group of swordsmiths were collectively known as the Gobankaji in Kyoto, and the ones that went to Okinoshima were known as the Oki Gobankaji. But then in Showa 14, 1939, there was the Showa Gobankaji. So 25 smiths all made swords in honor of Emperor Go-Toba. 10 were donated to Oki Jinja on Okinoshima, and 15 were donated to Minase Jingu there. So recently we started the Heisei Gobankaji. We started in the Heisei era, but in between it changed to Reiwa. But we're focusing on swordsmiths who had the main of their career in the Heisei era, And we just donated the first sword like 2 years ago.
Wow.
And we're getting ready to donate the second sword now. But we'd like to make a Heisei Gobankaji, to honor Emperor Go-Toba's contributions to Japanese swords, because he's admiring swords as art objects and also taking a part in making swords, probably elevated the Japanese sword to what it is today. Because, imperial hand.
Right.
And there's about 13 of these swords that still remain today.
Wow. So what will be the tradition of Japanese sword will be in the future from now on? What do you predict? What will be the future of Japanese swords?
Well, I think that every generation, the way that we appraise Japanese swords is that we can tell there's influences from that time, but they're always looking back to the past. So there's this continuation of looking back to the past influenced by the present. And I think that in the future, it will be the same. There's been collaborations with certain, anime and things. And I don't know if this is the way to go, because that's an unknown future.
Right.
But I think the Japanese swords will continue. I think that the craft is in a little bit of peril at the moment. But when people realize, I think they'll do their best to make it survive.
Do you think that there will be more swordsmiths outside Japan? Can that be passed on to?
You can't make swords outside Japan and have them licensed in Japan. That's one of the laws. But I think that Japanese swords can only be made by Japanese people that were born here. If there are people here that have really adopted the Japanese lifestyle, so they're more Japanese than Japanese, Nihonjin yori Nihonjin, people that are doing the crafts in Japan, and that's great. But there's people outside Japan that are taking part in the craft, and I think that even though they have very good skills, but they haven't grown up in Japan, so they don't have that spiritual background that Japanese people do. So I think that it takes away from the craft a little bit, But I think we need to somehow revitalize the craft in Japan.
I see. How's the Japanese people, so as a foreigner, do you feel that the Japanese living in the modern world are respecting the Japanese swords, or they're starting to forget the beauty of it?
I think many younger people, sometimes they're reminded by Token Rambu and things like this. But I think that in general, the spiritual sides of Japanese swords might be being forgotten, But, when people get older, they tend to become more appreciative of things. So maybe in their younger days, when they take an interest in manga and anime and games, maybe when they get older, they'll take more of an interest in the actual objects themselves, I
see. I hope your book, will this be translated into Japanese as well?
Maybe, I don't know.
I hope so, because this is a really beautiful book, and I think
thanks very much.
The Japanese people should read this.
Some Japanese people have taken an interest in it and asked the same question.
So what's the main message of publishing this book in all over countries, and especially in English? What do you want to express?
I want people to understand Japanese swords correctly. I think that they're grossly misunderstood. A lot of it was because the Japanese sword is such a strong object, not as a weapon, as a strong object, that it is easily used for propaganda in either direction, as a bad thing or as a good thing, So, and that's the power of Japanese swords. I think that's the core power of Japanese swords. And, so that's in another sense, that's the kind of spiritual strength, And I want people to understand Japanese swords as as what they really are. You know, that they're not just weapons, that they're much more complicated than that. You know,
I think even the Japanese, like they'll misuse the word Nihonto or Japanese swords in a bad way. So I think we need to rediscover what Japanese swords means to our society.
Yeah. I think that after the Second World War, they became a bit taboo.
Yeah, taboo. Yeah.
You know? But again, that's because of this propaganda and misuse on the other side of that propaganda.
It was used for like right-wing nationalism.
Right.
Yes.
Right, you know. But you know, I mean, but Japanese swords has over 1,000-year history.
Yeah.
You know, and you can't judge the sword on just like that 5-7 years. You know.
Right.
I think that's a mistake.
I agree.
Japanese swords have always been art objects, but even in the Muromachi period, there was mass-produced blades that are not of great artistic quality. They were like, you know, they could be used as weapons and thrown away. And in the Second World War, there was mass-produced blades, gunto, you know, military swords, and these swords are not recognized, and it's common in Japanese culture that, you know, that these swords, they were just for that time. They were just weapons. We don't need them now. You know, let's just keep the good ones, the artistic ones, and pass them down.
Do you have any advice for someone like starting to become interested in starting the journey into the world of Japanese swords?
Don't use me as a role model because I've done everything backwards. You know?
What do you mean backwards?
So I didn't go to college. I got into the British Museum by chance, kind of thing, you know, and I done everything backwards. I would first of all, if you're a collector or you want to get into becoming a curator or something of Japanese swords, I would read lots of books, read lots of sword books first, and then before even thinking about buying a sword, you know.
And of course, your book.
Yes. But you know, but if you want to study Japanese swords, I would go and learn Japanese language first, and then things like specialist subjects like kobun, kanbun, Old Japanese, and kanbun, you know, and things like this as some of your side subjects, you know, and so you can build tools for studying Japanese swords, so that when you comes to reading all of the first, the primary sources, you can read the Japanese books, things like this, and then you can also translate, you know. So I think that's the way to go. And then you have to come to Japan, especially if you want to improve your Japanese. You have to come to Japan, live in Japan, but then also attend lots of study groups where you get to see lots of swords, lots of different swords, you know. And they put out, and you're put to the test where you have to make a guess of what they are and things like this, because then you push yourself. But at the same time, it's like a game. So just enjoy it. It's not, don't make a great pressure of it, you know. So
you have to actually see and touch the actual sword.
Unless you see lots of different swords, you're not going to see the changes in hues and texture and the different activities within the hamon, and you build a database in your own head of people's idiosyncrasies in the blade, you know.
Okay, Paul-san, I think we need to wrap up. Any final comments or some things we have not touched upon, or
not that I can think. I think we talked about quite a lot of things, you know. But it's the field of swords is so deep. I could probably go on all day. So I don't know. I don't know where to stop. To be honest.
Okay, thank you so much, Paul Martin. Thanks for joining our show.
Thank you very much.